ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, please welcome Guus on the stage. Yup.
Hey guys, how are you all? Perfect. It's so nice to be here in India, I must say. I really enjoyed my time here. I've been to Delhi before I came to Udaipur. Beautiful country. So, because nobody really knows me since it's my first talk at any Laravel, just a quick introduction to myself. I'm old school, I'm 50 years old, so I grew up in the ZX Spectrum era of this world. I was live coding in the computer shop at age 11, like this. It happened. I also have a bachelor degree in software engineering. It's kind of my hobby. I love it the most, but anything computers is good for me. My career has been mostly done around storage administration, working for EMC back in the day when they came out with the baby Clarions and the mid-height symmetric storage arrays. So I know a lot about infrastructure, operating systems, how they work, what they do, what they don't do. And that sort of 15 to 20 years of career led me to know all about, customer success around Forge, because I know infrastructure. And if you guys have a question about, my server isn't working, or I did an in-place upgrade and now, the package won't install, I'll probably have an answer for you. What I'm not or who I'm not, you'll see throughout the presentation. I don't do animations. So you can ask me anything, but don't ask me about animations. Also, I see that you all are wearing red. I'm wearing red too, right? Oh, I'm colorblind. This isn't red. Hang on 1 second. I'll change it. Red, isn't it? Yes, it is. So my hobbies, IT, obviously, baking, obviously. I like cycling, swimming, reading, cross-stitching, anything really that I can sit and do. I was born a month late, and from that moment on, I was lazy. I still am lazy. Anyways, let's get to the bones of the talk. We talk about infrastructure, and we all have this idea that our application is going to make it, so it needs to be running all the time. We have insane global success. Everybody wants to use our application. There cannot be any outage. How do we do that from an infrastructure point of view? Now, obviously, the answer is redundancy. But you don't want to start with 1 million servers and geolocated load balancers and all that jazz, because that's expensive. What you're going to start with is your minimum valuable product or your go-to-market product, and you have one server that can handle, your first customer or your first 2 customers. It's an app server, so it has your database, it has your Redis cache, it has your web servers, it does your workers, and it's all going very well. And, over time, you hopefully get a couple of extra clients. You're going to have to scale up your server. Now, every time you scale up your server, there's a few things that you need to make sure you change. First of all, you need to make sure you give your database a new lease on the memory in the system, in terms of caching, in terms of buffering. So you need to tweak those parameters. Secondly, you need to always make sure you have enough database connections allowed in the system so that all your new workers and all your new FPM processes can actually log on to the database. Then you need to adjust, obviously, how many FPM workers you have and how many queue workers you want to have. And you need to make sure that you increase your open file limits on the system. And as you can see in the box, right there, there is a limit to the server size that you can have. And yes, it is a limit because what I learned from India is that the people in India accept everything. We're friendly to all sorts of people. We're not just Vegemite or Marmite. No, we do anything. So I want India to be in the middle of that talk with the word limit. And for India, there's no limit to accepting other cultures. So let's go with limit. Once you've reached that stage where scaling up is not possible anymore, you need to start scaling out. And the first obvious scale out is that you separate your database layer from your application layer. It's very easy to do. Sorry, I see flies here. It's very easy to do because your database is obviously a sort of self-contained layer of your application. The way to separate them is not to move your database, but to move everything else off the server, because everything else is mostly code, which you can just download from your repository again and leave your data where it is. The benefit of that is that you can obviously let the database handle all the SQL queries. You can optimize the performance of that server very well to actually deal with the database and the demand of the database on the server. At the same time, the app server that you now have is going to handle everything app-wise. So the web layer, the cache layer, it's going to run your workers. You still need to adjust all your working parameters because you now have maybe two smaller servers, so you need to scale down your database memory allocation, or maybe you need to scale it up depending on where you're coming from. And you need to make sure that you have roughly 75% of the most important resource on the computer in constant use. For a database, that's probably the memory. For the app server, that's probably your CPU and your memory that you want to look at. But the sweet spot is always 75%. That leaves a little bit of room for growth, and it doesn't waste a lot of money. Because with the one big server, the obvious problem that you have ultimately is that your application is going to need to work towards a certain peak level of performance that happens maybe twice a year. Say, for example, it's a commercial application and you're selling stuff that is, T-shirts or something like that, and you have a big sort of holy period of the year where you need to sell a lot of commodities, and then maybe you have the India Independence Day where you need to also sell a lot of commodities, but all the other 11 months of the year or 10 months of the year, your application isn't being used all that much. If you have one server, you need to make sure that one server deals with all that load, but you cannot scale it down easily. Some providers would provide that unless you have scaled up with or you need to scale down to a smaller disk size, then they won't. So you're stuck with the high bill for the big server. And this is obviously the best way to go, to scale out and to make sure you have multiple machines that you can grow independently. And that independent grow will help you to make sure your bill is at the right point, your invoice is at the right price point, and your application has the power where it needs that power. There's still a limit though, because even that one app server that now only does the workers and the web and the caching still can only grow that big. The same thing holds for your database as well. It can only grow so big. After that, you need to look at what you want to do else. You need to scale out further. Scaling out further, basically the next easy step would be to separate your workers from your web layer of software. So you get a dedicated server that only handles your worker software and you get one server, or you have one server that handles most of your web application things. Now, what I would say here is you would want to put a cache server in there as well, because the communication, especially in the Laravel world, with queues and workers via Redis is a lot quicker than via databases. Also, the load that your queue systems or your workers will put on the database just for the queuing aspect of the job is not necessarily application related. So if you can outsource that out of the database into a separate cache server, that would be beneficial for future growth. Again, you need to adjust your working parameters. You now have a worker server with the same power as your previous server, so you can run a lot more workers. You can even look at, prioritizing queues, that you have maybe a mail queue and a reverb queue, and maybe you have like a long-running podcast presentation queue. You cannot prioritize them all on that one server. But you must, again and again, not forget to also look at the database, because now all of a sudden you have two servers that need to connect to the one database server. So your database connections need to be updated as well. The next thing that you can do then is either on the web or on the worker side, you can start to swarm those workers or those web servers. Swarming for me is a term where you have multiple small machines that do the same job that you could almost automate to scale up and down as you need. And the worker servers are especially easy because there's nothing that controls them necessarily. Whether you have 1, 10, 15, or 2 makes no difference to the way your queues are being handled, other than more efficiently, obviously. And because the worker server will always have the same setup, it's very easy to automate as the first type of server that you want to... Jesus, I really see flies here. What's going on? I'm going crazy. So the worker servers are the first servers that you can really automate to scale up and down based on requirements of performance. Again, the same holds as when we said with the one server, if you have peak periods of business, you can scale up and scale down as you need. We can do the same with the web server layer. We can automate that as well. It's fairly easy to script that. Most providers have an API. Most providers will have a way to talk to the load balancer that you're obviously going to need in front of the web servers to add more upstream servers. One of the things that you need to be aware of, especially when handling load balancers and web servers underneath them, is that you need to make sure that your load balancer and your upstream servers are not caching responses onto disk. That's a fairly tricky thing to detect, because what you'll see on the front end at the load balancer level is you get reasonably good response times. But at an upstream server level, you get longer response times. Those are not normally tracked by Nginx, for example, unless you specifically track them in your access log. So if you don't use access logs at all, you will not see there's a discrepancy between response times between the load balancer and the upstream server. And you're going to miss the fact that your upstream server or your load balancer is actually using the disk to buffer responses to your clients. That will slow down any website like ridiculously. So make sure you control that. The other thing about load balancers that you need to make sure of is, because you now have multiple web servers more than you had before, you need to make sure that your database can handle the amount of connections to the database from not 4 or 5 servers, but from all your web servers as well. So again, you need to look at adjusting your operating parameters. That's always going to be an important thing to do. Then you get to redundancy stage of your application growth. where you can look at adding more power to your database layer by adding maybe a few read servers with one write database. Maybe you need to do something tricky. Now, obviously, we all know Aaron Francis and Tobias Petri, our database gurus in the community. I'm sure they can help you with setting up replication and making sure it's working for you the way it needs to work for the application. But in essence, I would think from a Laravel point of view, you can have like multiple read servers and one write server from a database layer perspective, so that make sure that your read commands are going to only the read databases and your change commands are only going to the write databases. That can allow you to optimize indexing, for example. If you're going to use a thing like Refurb, or maybe you want to monitor your database and your system usage via Pulse, you might want to have like a Redis cluster in order to make sure you have more power and in order to make sure that your environment is powerful enough to handle all that load, is that you can replace any server at any time. Specifically when you have new operating systems coming in, and specifically in the next year or two, there's a few big changes on the horizon that would make a redundant infrastructure very helpful to have. For one, very old or older PHP versions are going to be not supported anymore because Ubuntu 20 will go end of life next year. Sorry, that basically means that you're gonna have to have Ubuntu 22 or Ubuntu 24 servers that may not necessarily support PHP 7 or older. But if you only have the one app server, you're not gonna easily upgrade that. So redundancy will certainly help there. The one thing that you may not be able to update quickly is your load balancer. What can help there is if you have like a dedicated IP address that you set up on the load balancer, that you configure in your DNS, so that your clients are only connecting to that one dedicated IP address. And then any system changes, change very quickly, because you only need to transport your dedicated IP address from the old load balancer to the new load balancer. Flexible as well in all of your worker servers and your web servers, because you can just fire up new instances, add them to your swarm, and remove the old ones from the swarm. Now for the future, I would like to do a few extra talks in the future. Obviously, everybody would like that, for sure. I want to start looking at specifically load balancing and specifically how you can deal with SSL certificates. A lot of the time it's fairly difficult to make sure that not only the client communication is encrypted, but also the communication between the load balancer and the upstream servers is either unreachable for eavesdroppers or is protected by SSL encryption. You might want to make sure that if you have multiple applications running on your web farm, you might want to make sure that your load balancer cannot mix traffic between one application and the other application. A way to do that is to make sure that the encryption on the private network is set up correctly. But there are other ways to deal with that as well, and I'd like to go deeper in that in the future. And there is obviously also a point where, for certain applications, you may want to control your outgoing network traffic so that you only have what they would call one point of presence, rather than 3 or 4 different servers that can talk to the outside world. And another topic really that I want to look at is the cost of all this infrastructure. Because as you know, if you start with a small server at DigitalOcean, you pay $4 a month or whatever it is. The big servers, $300, $400, $500, $600 per month. That's a lot of money. And at some point you have to start asking yourself, is it worth all that money, or is it better if I just buy a server and do a colo? You know, a lot of the bigger applications are standing on the verge of making a decision in that regard, because it would be sensible to have one server that you maybe pay 30 grand for, that you have 5 years. But if you then look at the virtual server layers that you have from DigitalOcean or AWS or whatever, over the same time span of 5 years, that might be more than 30 grand. So you want to make sure that you spend your money well. But yeah, you know, if Vishal or Abbas can help me get into future talks, that would be very beneficial. But I think for me now, and in light with the timings and so forth, I think I'm going to give everybody back 10 minutes. And this is kind of the end of the talk for today.
All right, Guus.
Yeah.
First question, what's your diet plan?
My health plan. Okay. I have a friend in Delhi who is also my meditation teacher, and she is very good with food plans. She does a lot of yoga. She's into healthy eating and that sort of stuff. So I'm going to ask her for a plan to get smaller t-shirt sizes.
Yeah, perfect. That reminds me, I have another question for you. We always say that like Jai Gurudev, right?
Yes.
So whenever like we say hi to each other, he always replies back that Jai Gurudev. So what is the reason? I mean, what's the history?
The history for me is when I was 15, my math teacher was into Zen Buddhism, and he took me to a school camp for a week where he trained all of us on Buddhism. Meditation, and I was kind of the only kid that picked up on it, and I've always been meditating. I've always been taking time for myself, and 2 years ago, yeah, a friend of mine in Bombay basically said she was working on this or at this Oberon School of Business, which is part funded by the Art of Living. And she then introduced me to their Art of Living happiness program, and I followed that. And
that's how Jai Gurudev came in.
That's where Jai Gurudev comes from.
So I have a couple of questions from the Twitter. One of the guy like Pratmesh asked, when we start working on a new project, how should we plan about infrastructure for the application?
Just start with one small server. Don't spend any money on it. Yeah. Because it's, when you start developing, having a big server is a waste of money that you might want to spend somewhere else. So the smallest server that can handle 1 or 2 customers, maybe 1 concurrent user at all times, that's just fine. Even if you have 10 users, the chance of them using your system concurrently is not that big. So start small. Don't spend any money that you don't need to spend.
Perfect, Guus. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
Yeah.